Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengraber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello.
Hello, can I please speak with Julian Sands?
Yes, you are speaking to Julian Sands. Hello, Paul.
Hello, thank you so much for taking my call and for being a part of these quarantine tapes. How are you?
Well, I love the quarantine tapes. I've listened to them every day since you began broadcasting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Fascinating.
Well, thank you.
It's very diverse and interesting and humbling. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Humbling in what way? I'm curious about that.
Well, I mean,
word.
for instance, today, hearing from Dr. Lamas today, being a little more on the front line of the fight against C-19, makes my sort of contemplative existence rather inert by compare. I think that's what I mean by how.
You know, I feel the necessity really to gather a concert of voices, and having you on the show is very important to me, and I'm very glad that you're part of it. You were talking about your contemplative moment now during these quarantine times, and in a note you wrote that you. In some sense, it brings to the foreground what you call slow time, quietness, stillness, and breathing. And I'm curious how you might be able to unpack these terms. I'm always taken whenever I think about the word slowness. I always think about two quotations, as you probably noticed. I quote a lot, but there's one I very much love of Graham Greene, where he says, "There's a virtue in slowness which we have lost." And in some sense,
yes, I wouldn't disagree with Graham Greene. Which is the other quotation?
The other quotation is by Walter Benjamin, who said that man no longer works at what cannot be abbreviated.
Yes, well, I mean, wise words from both. But in the 1990s, there was a very sort of popular movement, which I think began in North Italy, called the slow movement, which was all about
slow food,
the development of the slow food supply and consumption. It was about, I think, unnecessary travel, and to a certain degree promoted walking over public transport where possible and practical. But of course, the slow movement was argued for more than 200 years ago by the poets Keats and Shelley. They both were sort of alarmed by the onset of the Industrial Revolution in England, and both of them saw that the importance of nature in people's lives, actively or reactively, was being eroded, and with those very words, they talked about. Famously in Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn, he begins it: "Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, slow time. I mean, it's something which he then goes on to say about this urn, which he's addressing. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other world than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. So I think, slow time allows us to absorb big nature, the aesthetics of the world around, the inner rhythms of our own biological system in a way that is much involuntarily avoided because of the speed at which so many of us live. The amount of activity we engage in which might be considered superfluous to the contemplative life. Now, me I'm an actor, so periods of being at home are not unusual. I'm prepared by the nature of my vocation to be at home and endure the weeks or perhaps months of what I would call fallow periods, where one isn't sort of inactive exactly, but one is just nurturing oneself for whatever the next project may be. And for me, that requires, for me personally, there's no rules about this. A lot of walking. I'm a keen mountain climber, so the walking is often.
I read about your passion for mountain climbing, and so when you use the word nurture, first of all, I'm curious. The Keats you quoted came from memory, I imagine.
Yes, well, but I cheat because over the last 2 or 3 years I've been touring a show called Keats Shelley, Ghosts and Lovers, which began in Rome at the Keats Shelley House Museum when they published an anthology of collected works and asked me to write the preface, and which I agreed to, but after a conditional of waiting for me to really re-immerse myself in their work, I couldn't believe, Paul, how contemporary, how modern, how vigorous, how vital, how political, philosophical, and sexy it all was. And and from my school days, I was much more interested in Ted Hughes or Harold Pinter, people with obvious contemporary muscle and presence. The romantic poet, I had a passing familiarity with. So being able to quote their work, it's what I do in my show.
Yeah, well, it's hardly cheating, right? But it's very humbling of you to say cheating. You just what you mean to say is that you know it by heart, but only recently, but still by heart. And I think there's a connection between knowing things by heart and maybe the kind of peregrination of walking and taking time, because I imagine we could have a long discussion, which we can't have now, but I hope that when this quarantine ends, we will in fact be able to have it in person. I know that I know that there are the advisories of limiting daily exercise, but I think anybody who lives in Los Angeles has the opportunity to walk much further than they think they may be capable of. I mean, we were designed to walk. That's what our legs are for. And because there is generally a big sky around Los Angeles, there isn't the extreme high rises you'd find
in a conurbation like New York or even London. The vegetation at this time offers such extraordinary blossom.
I so agree with you. I had occasion once to speak with David Yulin, who wrote a whole book about walking in Los Angeles, and in a way going against the grain of the cliched version of what Los Angeles is about, namely a city where people don't walk. It's very interesting to me now, during this quarantine period, to see streets that are completely empty, but where people are in fact walking, even if during this social distancing moment, a very strange term. I would love to speak at some point with a sociologist about this whole notion of social distancing. But what is so interesting to me now is people are walking, even if they turn their heads away from you as you pass them by. There is a real desire to move around in that way. I'm reminded also, I remember quoting once to Pico Iyer, who was also on this show, a wonderful essay by George Santayana, which he wrote in the early years of the 19th century, of the 20th century, where he said that Aristotle said that plants are firmly planted in the soil, while human beings, Aristotle said, have the intelligence of locomotion. So we have,
that's a wonderful quote.
Isn't
for anybody who's listening, I could only recommend Richard Powers' The Overstory.
I adore it.
Yes, and explores that notion in such a beautiful and profound and moving way. I just finished it.
Yes.
But back to the walking and
the climate,
the blooms, the narcotic scents which drift. What I found is that although there might be an avoidance of the fellow walkers because people are generally observing social distancing, there is very often, more often than not, the raised arm of greeting, the sort of the nod of the head,
right,
which is so reminds one of the community,
right,
and the necessity of communicating some sort of acknowledgement of this being a shared experience. I think that's very refreshing and reflects a desire, a fundamental desire people have to reach out,
right, to stay connected,
and that's really
to stay connected in some way, even though we can't touch each other. We still need to be in contact with each other in one form or another. And when you were talking about walking, obviously, I'm always taken by a number of literary references and filmic references, in particular Werner Herzog speaking about the importance of traveling by foot, which is very much connected, of course, with the idea of what you were talking about the slow movement, the slow food movement, which is also a slow reading movement and a slow thinking movement. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how all of what we've spoken about so far connects to the quarantine and what might come out of it.
Well, I would hope that when the quarantine is relaxed, people will remember and embrace this longing for community that they may now be experiencing in isolation, and apply it to how we go about our daily lives. Remember to apply and appreciate the presence of others as enhancing our own experience, even if they are unknown to us or to some degree different from us.
Recently, you were part of a Monday evening concert. John Cage was on the program. And I'm
Yes.
wondering, I had occasion also to be on a Monday evening concert, and Jonathan Hepfer runs it so beautifully. And I'm curious what that experience of that piece of music was for you.
Well, for the listeners, I should, the John Cage piece required me to read from newsprint of the day, while other five performers played radios,
Right.
seeming at random stations, but very specifically prescribed in a score, at volume, fade up, fade down, when to be silent. So it was a sort of cacophony of a soundscape, a symphony of it could be music, radio, talk, me speaking live from news programs of the day, and it wasn't about the specific information,
Right.
which was coming from the radios or from me. It was about creating a soundscape and an experience for the listener, which allowed them to sort of view or view us, but hear this piece and take it as an existentialist impact on the nervous system, devoid of content.
This brings me to, I think, another love of yours, which is the love of radio.
Well, yes, I like radio as a medium, and I love performing for radio plays, sometimes reading short stories for the radio, both the BBC and various NPR affiliates. But what's remarkable is how the listeners completely imagine the set, the settings, far more comprehensively and effectively than any set designer or stage management crew could in a theatre setting.
I mean, radio made me think very much of our moment now, I must say, where we're confined to being alone if we're so lucky as to have a home, which is of course a whole other problem that I'm addressing with other guests. I've stopped counting my blessings because there are too many. But the radio is this very extraordinary medium whereby which we're alone in the presence of others, and we can imagine others who in a way haunt us. And I want to talk about another haunting of yours, and it's a very strong one, and it's one that I feel that you're never alone quite, because always with you is Harold Pinter. And before you even talk about Pinter, which I really want you to do, I want to read to you my very favorite two lines of Pinter. On the 5th of November 2001, he wrote to Sir Tom Stoppard, saying, "Dear Tom, thank you for your invitation to host a fundraising dinner in the private room of a top London restaurant. I would rather die. All the best. Yours, Harold Pinter."
Pinter is someone who dominated my life since I was at high school. His play, The Birthday Party, was something I studied for my, what in England we call O-levels, and seeing the productions of his plays as a student, performing in them at drama school. When Harold came into a room, it was as if somebody had entered with a very large bird of prey on their arm or on their shoulder. There was nothing benign. One felt surveyed and intimidated, and all eyes would always go to Harold. He had this extraordinary, involuntarily, but not completely involuntarily, intimidating presence. And he didn't do small talk. He didn't suffer anything in the way of social pleasantries. So when he asked me to prepare this concert of his poetry, even though I've been involved with his dramatic work for decades, I had no idea of it. And it was such a revelation when over our tutorials, he would give me these poems which revealed his intelligence, his humor, his romance, and his humanity in an extraordinarily personal, direct way. Very difficult to write about Harold Pinter, the person, from the dramatic works, study of them. But from the poetry, they were totally unfiltered. And he had started writing, he was a poet since he was a young teenager, much before he started writing plays. And in their brevity, there is such intimacy and profundity. One is called It Is Here for A, which is a celebration of his 33 years with his wife, Antonia Fraser. It is here. What sound was that? I turn away into the shaking room. What was that sound that came in on the dark? What is this maze of light it leaves us in? What is this stance we take to turn away and then turn back? What did we hear? It was the breath we took when we first met. Listen, it is here.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a poem which is universal, I think, to anybody who's been in love or endured a long relationship, who's had that privilege. Paul?
As indeed you.
Hello?
Yes, I'm very much there, but you just silenced me.
Well, I mean, silences me, and and what happened when I read these poems at the event for which Harold has prepared me, we sat there in the third row, mouthing the words along with me, which was the most intimidating thing I've ever experienced.
Yes, I can imagine. I can well imagine. In closing, Julian, I'd like you to comment on another side of Pinter, the very indignant one, but I think the very powerful one, the one that speaks to me very strongly also. I once had occasion with the writer Ariel Dorfman to talk about that Pinter. The Pinter actually you knew well at the moment when he got the Nobel Prize and could not deliver it in person. And in that Nobel Prize, he says, "The crimes of the United States have been systematic, constant, vicious, remorseless, but very few people have actually talked about them. You have to hand it to America. It has exercised a quite clinical manipulation of power worldwide, while masquerading as a force for universal good. It's a brilliant, even witty, highly successful act of hypnosis. I put to you that the United States is without doubt the greatest show on the road. Brutal, indifferent, scornful, and ruthless. It may be, but it is also very clever. As a salesman, it is out on its own, and its most sellable commodity is self-love."
I think that quotation can only be taken in context of the the whole lecture, the whole
True.
essay, because although the quotation you have read makes it very singularly an abrasive indictment of American foreign policy, I think the final paragraph, which I use in my show, is a more just as applicable to America, perhaps never more so, but maybe is more circumspect. Can I share that with you, Paul?
Of course.
He says, when we look into a mirror, we think the image that confronts us is accurate. But move a millimeter and the image changes. We're actually looking at a never-ending range of reflections. But sometimes a writer has to smash the mirror, for it is on the other side of the mirror that the truth stares at us. I believe that despite the enormous odds which exist, unflinching, unswerving, fierce intellectual determination as citizens to define the real truths of our lives and our societies is a crucial obligation which defaults upon us all. It is, in fact, mandatory. If such a determination is not embodied in our political vision, we have no hope of restoring what is so nearly lost, the dignity of man.
It's extraordinary. It sounds like some of the great Nobel Prize speech also of Faulkner. I mean, it's really, really powerful. And
yes, and if anybody was in any doubt about Pinter's deserving of the Nobel Prize, they only have to read this the whole speech to stand the gravitas of his penmanship and his word.
I think you've given our listeners something to listen to during their quarantine if they can. Julian, it's been such a pleasure to speak to you, and I feel like we have much more to talk about when we in fact meet in person. And I also want to thank you for your support of this idea of Dublab's idea of hosting these quarantine tapes, and I very much look forward to meeting you when such a moment should come. And maybe
I look forward to that, Paul, and it'll leave you, if I may, with one very short further poem by Harold. Because it addresses the times we're living in and how we behave within these times and the consequences they have. And when I read this poem at, I think it was the Irish rapper, a nuclear physicist stayed behind and told me in all his time at NASA, he had never seen in prose or heard in prose something which so readily addressed Einstein's theory of relativity. The poem is called I Know the Place. I know the place, it is true. Everything we do corrects the space between death and me and you.
A few words can do a lot.
I believe so. I believe so, Paul.
Julian.
And it's my privilege to be the delivery system of the words of Pinter and Shelly and Keats and Wordsworth and
to be
and
continued.
Richard Kenny.
To be continued for sure. But for now, bye-bye and stay well, stay safe. And I very much look forward to taking a long walk with you.
Simply, I would enjoy that. One of my favorite walks, and perhaps you'd be interested in this, is to walk the whole of Sunset Boulevard from downtown at Cesar Chavez to the Pacific Ocean.
Let's do it and think about Ed Ruscha.
Yes, indeed.
All the best to you.
All right, Paul.
Bye-bye. Thank you for now. Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.